This is also something that astounded me as I got into this. The degree to which American foreign policy since World War II has been shaped by the perceived primacy of using military force to protect the flow of overseas oil to the United States. This began very early. In 1943 and 1944, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the first American president to grasp that what I told you earlier, that even though at that time the U.S. was the major supplier of its oil, he understood that we were going to run out of it and that we would become dependent on foreign supplies. And so it was FDR who first made oil a national security matter for the United States, militarizing our oil policy. He personally got involved by traveling to the Middle East to meet with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of the Saudi royal dynasty with which we deal today. And he met with Abdulaziz aboard the USS Quincy, an American warship, in 1945. And he made a bargain with the devil, is what I would call it, whereby the U.S. would protect the royal family against its enemies, domestic and foreign, in return for privileged access to Saudi Arabian oil. And that devil's bargain continues to govern American foreign policy to this day. No American president has ever spoken out against that compact. And it was that arrangement that I would argue shaped much of American policy, even during the Cold War. So the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, and the Nixon Doctrine all were shaped by the primacy of protecting Saudi Arabia and the oil from the Persian Gulf. And that led to the most crystal expression of this policy, the Carter Doctrine of 1980. This was January 1980. It followed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Both happened in 1979. And in January 1980, President Carter told a joint session of Congress, it was actually his State of the Union address, that the oil from the Persian Gulf was so vital to American economy and national security, and this is a quote, "We would use any means necessary, including military force, to protect the flow of Persian Gulf oil." And that principle remains American policy today. The Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, the Nixon Doctrine have all faded away, but the Carter Doctrine continues to govern American policy. We saw that in the Iran-Iraq War, which I alluded to earlier, when President Reagan said that attacks on tankers in the Gulf were a threat and had to be, military force was needed to protect their flow. And then George Bush Sr. On August 8th, 1990, following five or 6 days after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, many of you will remember that occasion, President Bush Sr. went on national television to announce that he was sending troops to Saudi Arabia to protect that country against Iraqi forces. Then in Kuwait, he said, "We're going to draw a line in the sand." Many of you remember his most famous statement. And he did not mean by the line in the sand, we were going to take a principled stand against oppression or aggression. What he meant is, we're going to protect Saudi Arabia's oil fields on this side of the line and keep the Iraqis on the other side of the line. So the Carter Doctrine was the basis upon which the U.S. intervened in the first Persian Gulf War in 1990-1991. Now, at the end of that war, as you'll recall, President Bush turned to his advisors, including Colin Powell, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and said, "What should we do?" The Iraqis had been driven out of Kuwait. And Colin Powell and other advisors reportedly told George Bush, don't continue, as some people were advocating, into Iraq itself and invade Baghdad, because the coalition of states that had supported our efforts up until that point would drop out. They wouldn't support an invasion of Iraq. And you're going to arouse Iraqi nationalism and have much higher American casualties than was the case up until that point. And George Bush said, okay, thank you, we'll stop here on the Kuwait-Iraq border. And instead, we would encircle Iraq and try to bring about regime change by strangling Iraq to death. And so the U.S. imposed economic sanctions. The purpose of the sanctions were to so weaken the Iraqi state and Saddam Hussein that regime change would occur, that the Iraqi regime would collapse. And on that basis, President Clinton perpetuated the sanctions regime all throughout the 1990s. But when President Bush Jr. took office in 2001, he conducted a review of sanctions policy, this time by Colin Powell again, now the Secretary of State. And what Colin Powell concluded and reported was that the sanctions regime, far from weakening Saddam Hussein, was actually strengthening Saddam Hussein by making him a nationalist hero to many Iraqis who were suffering terribly, but Saddam Hussein was standing up to the American imperial superpower and so on and so forth, and he was gaining the sympathy of many Arabs around the world. And so the policy of sanctions, which were meant to crush Saddam Hussein, were deemed a failure. But bear in mind, sanctions were a continuation of war by other means. They were a continuation of the struggle with Iraq that began in 1990. And what people around President Bush Jr. concluded was that sanctions were a losing proposition. We either had to abandon them and admit failure and defeat in the Persian Gulf, which was unthinkable to American elites, or we had to get rid of Saddam Hussein through other means, through military force. There was some debate about that within the administration prior to 9/11, but we now know shortly after that President Bush decided that the only option left given this history of struggle, was to invade Iraq. And in my view, future historians will conclude, as I believe, that the war with Iraq was not an isolated event all on its own. Yes, there were other things going on. Weapons of mass destruction and terrorism were brought up, and we now know that all of that was bogus. But what I think is clear is that Bush and the people around him, for them, this was a valid, legitimate part of a continuous American policy that's not just a Bush strategy or a Republican strategy, but it's an American elite strategy that has been our policy for 50 years to make sure that no other power would ever threaten America's dominance of the Persian Gulf region and the flow of oil. So they could make the argument, we weren't fighting for oil, and they could, convince themselves that they meant we're not going to seize the oil, to use it. They were fighting for American security, for national security. But as you have seen, American national security in the Persian Gulf means controlling the flow of petroleum. This was a war for power, for domination and control of this region, in my mind. So in that sense, the Iraq War is not an anomaly, but as I've come to see it, a continuation of a long-term American policy of domination.